so much you can be exposed to at any given visit. But with each one, it's an added note, an added experience. And when I'm speaking with participants when they come in, and I'm realizing also what I know, because my knowledge is being tested, because I have to explain to them why the city is the way it is, what I have seen, what I've experienced, this is why it's hot this time of year, or don't worry, in the winter it will be cooler, It's nice to be able to speak with some kind of reference of experience, and a city that is not necessarily where I'm from.
Curating a triennial sounds incredibly daunting and exciting. Without giving away too many of your trade secrets, can you walk us through your planning process?
It's been really interesting. I mean, it started obviously with a theme, and then it goes down to who relates with this thing within different regions, and also trying to keep a level of balance, because if I have my way, I'll just bring everybody from Lagos. But at the end of the day, it is an international exhibition, and so you have to find people who also start to resonate with the theme, this idea of innovative technologies from the global south. And what was really important to me is I also realized very quickly what I know and what I don't know. And it was important to me very early on to have an advisory board of great thinkers within the field and surrounding the field who could add their voice and add value and make suggestions from different regions, different people who could be included within this, this overall process.
We talked about this briefly yesterday, but how will you go about putting your Tosin stamp on the triennial?
I think generally I have a very positive, optimistic energy, and I think that will definitely come across in the work. It's also very important to me as a mother that it is accessible. Architecture tends to be very high intellectual. I remember as a first year student sitting in evening lectures and not having a clue what people were talking about. And I want people of different sectors, people within the city, visitors, intellectuals, students to come, and everyone should be able to take something back from this. It should be so layered that it should be an experience that isn't necessarily daunting. A 6-year-old should be able to come and say there was a particular piece that they really liked and they remember it. That process of being able to live through experiences is very valuable and important to me. And at the end of the day, the most important part of an exhibition like this that is really asking us to address our issues with climate change, it's not necessarily to answer questions, but to leave people feeling inspired and optimistic and hopefully influence how they will live their lives moving forward.
As we mentioned briefly earlier, working and living in Lagos can sometimes be challenging. You have to learn very quickly the art of adaptability.
Yes.
The pivot game here has to be extremely strong, but it's also incredibly exciting. Can we talk about how the unique challenges that one can face here also present an opportunity for innovation? Can you delve into that a bit more?
Gosh, I think, I'll be honest, I think the whole purpose of this symposium will give examples of how that can be done. I remember yesterday at dinner with Vinka Shunubara, we had this discussion, and she did say he doesn't know how architects are able to manage in this environment. And I said that it will teach you patience, but you do learn coping mechanisms for how you can get things done. It is a place where if you come in with a very ideological mindset of how things are done, it does challenge you, but you quickly learn that if you're able to put in positions of adaptability to get things done, things can be achieved, but you can't just take it as a status quo that this is the way things are done and things can always happen in this kind of standardized trajectory. And as long as you're willing to accept that you may have to change and you may have to adapt, then you're more likely to get things done. But what's really great about this city is that flexibility really brings out so much. I honestly believe now as a designer that if you have too much freedom, it does actually stifle your creativity. And actually being put in a box helps you to really push the boundaries. And when you really do push those boundaries, you're actually surprised at how much you're actually able to achieve, because you would never have gone down that path if it had been easy.
So that's interesting, because we're often told that artists need no boundaries. You're saying that some constraints can actually help the work, not hinder it.
Constraints are good, yes. Constraints are good.
constraints are good. Can we talk about the constraints of patriarchy in this town? Yesterday at our dinner with Yinka Shonabar, oh, I hear some groans and some... Did I hear a snap of recognition? Okay, I heard a snap of recognition too. We spoke about being a woman working in this environment and working in these spaces, and of course the architecture field has historically been male dominated, so that's not unique to Nigeria. But there is a form of patriarchy here that is not necessarily unique to Nigeria, but is very familiar to people who live and work here. How do you navigate being a woman in both in the architecture space in Nigeria at large, being a quote-unquote boss woman? How do you manage that?
I'll be honest, it has gotten easier over the years. There's another layer that you didn't mention, which is ageism.
Okay.
I'm sure
so
there are
gender
a lot of people,
and ageism.
yes, a lot of people have experienced that here as well. I think with everything, it's about proving yourself, and people are, I don't think people are necessarily ageist or sexist, or there is a patriarchal system here. But in reality, once you prove yourself, it becomes easier, because at the end of the day, everyone is looking for results. If you're able to show that you are competent and you're able to deliver, yes, you will always get bits. But if there are 5 women in the room and they know that you're the problem solver, people will still gravitate towards you. So results eventually help to break those barriers down. But I will say that starting out and being at the bottom of the chain is difficult, and you have to be optimistic, and you have to be a go-getter, and you have to be dogmatic in what you're trying to achieve, and learning the wisdom where it's not always the fight from the front. Sometimes you have to go around the back to get what you want done.
I was speaking with an art curator last week, and she was venting about working in Lagos, and at one point she says, the lows are so low, but the highs are orgasmic. It's very early in the morning, so we won't talk about orgasms in Lagos, unless you want to. I'm kidding. But do the victories here feel sweeter?
They are sweeter. I finished school in 2007. I've achieved things here that if I had stayed in Europe, I don't think anyone would know my name. It can be very tough, and there are many days you think, but I guess the great things about success is people don't see the back end, and it's important to remind people, and especially younger people coming up, the importance of consistency. By the time you see the tip of the iceberg, you haven't seen the mess underneath. It takes a lot to get to this point. But I honestly believe that I've been able to achieve things here at scales as an individual, which may have been done in the collective of a practice if I had stayed in Europe. But it's an unpaved road. You make your path, and if you're intentional, you can actually achieve quite a lot in this environment.
One of the many things I love about working in Lagos is just how close-knit the creative community is here. We had dinner at Chef Michael Alegbede's fantastic restaurant, Itan, and he spoke about how your architectural practice and how you speak about your work has actually informed how he speaks about his work. Are you similarly influenced by the creatives around you who are outside of the architecture space?
Very much so, very much so. And I think that's one of the great things about the intensity of the industry here. There's a lot of cross-pollination that happens. I've worked with artists, I've worked with Victor Ekamane, who's a really good friend. I'm very good friends also with Rookie from Dial-Up, so I mean there's so much that happens in this environment where people are connecting with other people. Sometimes it's not necessarily work, but it could be from that interesting conversation, and it sparks up a thought of another opportunity for a project, It really is a very strong condensation, and I honestly believe that, these potentially are actually quite special times. I don't want to say that it's not going to continue on into the future, but the practitioners who are here now are doing such great work, and we're beginning to see international interest. It's so interesting. I went to see the African fashion exhibition at the V&A, and I was telling my daughter, that's my friend, that's my friend, that's my friend, that's my friend. You know, where have you, you know, for her, this is normal, but, you know, I didn't grow up seeing people that I knew that were having their works in museums, you know, but for her, that's a norm. And to think that at the age of 11, you get that, you know, you think what the possibilities are. And it's just great to see so much interesting work coming out from this region now.
Let's talk about that, because Lagos in particular seems to be on fire creatively right now. Fashion is on fire. Nollywood has taken over Netflix. You can't go to TikTok without seeing somebody either dancing to Afro beats or figuring out some new choreography challenge. The culinary scene is about to explode. I was in New York this summer. Everybody was talking about Shayo and Last and chopping breakfast. And it's like, this is Manhattan. What do you know about chopping breakfast? So, what is going on right now? Why do you think this period in Lagos, particularly in the creative community, has been so fruitful? And why is this metropolis, I call it a town, but why is this town bubbling and at this center of global culture right now?
I think it's actually because so much hasn't been provided. This is very much a bottom-up, you know. And I think when it's bottom-up, it's very much about community. It's very much about network. It's interesting how it's so many different genres and industries that are actually seeing this kind of renaissance all at the same time. I can't tell you, maybe like they would say twins is the yam that we eat, but there is an energy, you know, and it's infectious, you know. If one industry is doing well, I mean, music was coming out in the early noughties as the first industry, and also fashion, but then everyone else is now following suit. You know, product design is also becoming very big here. It's still in its infancy, but to be honest, it's the next big thing that I think is going to come out of Lagos as an industry. But I think it's just a general positive energy and optimism. And I think we are very much still about sharing in this environment. People are not yet selfish with their creativity, you know. People know that we grow from the community, we grow from each other. It's not a selfish kind of creativity, and I think that's what's really helped for it to kind of ferment.
When I recently interviewed you for Architectural Digest magazine, you described your design aesthetic as Afro-minimalism. Can you break that down for us? What does that term mean exactly?
So I'm a child of modernism. I went to when I went to school and studied architecture, the principles were based on modernism and lack of ornamentation, truth to material, light and form. But I think as a designer, I've gone through a personal journey of discovering my cultural identity and finding a way to represent it in my work, which isn't necessarily going back to what would have been possibly a traditional building for just being traditional, but trying to bring it up to a contemporary lineage. And that journey of discovery is where I've been able to find my place and I guess my piece. And aesthetically, I love I guess it's almost more Japanese, and people do say that there is a reference with Japanese architecture to also our culture, but it's a place where I felt comfortable. I could represent myself, I could push my idea of my identity, because growing up, I questioned what really is an African building, you know, aesthetically, what do we represent or see? And growing up in an environment where we were colonized, there was a big burst of industrialization, population increase. Some of the principles that were used that would have formed the basis of a lot of our traditional buildings couldn't carry that trajectory through into the contemporary field. And if you ask an average African, what's an African building, they will always go back to the vernacular, they will always go back to the traditional. And finding a place where that can come forward. We've been very fortunate that our language has carried forward, our fashion, our food, you know, our culture, our respect for our adults, you know, but it hasn't necessarily come across in the physicality of our buildings. And being able for a generation to say, no, we are now very conscious of this. We want to create this language, not for language's sake, but create a space where we can actually see who we are and have that represented as an aesthetic moving forward. That's really what has pushed the need for me to feel this reference to create this language and use it as a consistent means of representation in my work.
For years you've argued that African design must be localized, that architecture in Africa should be designed by Africans who understand Africa. And that seems like a no-brainer to me, but it still rarely happens on the continent. How can that change, and why is changing that of the utmost importance?
It's really important, particularly for architecture. And I guess the difference between architects and artists is that we are providing a service. You know, an artist has the luxury to be able to create in a vacuum, but we don't. It's very interesting. If an architect is pushing a language and your client says, I really don't want this, change it. You know, you have to find a way to be able to carry your client along, but also push the need for this agenda. Contextuality is so important. A lot of our urbanism has been brought about, you know, by external factors, and in a situation where we need to find our place, we need to push this language, but we have to make it aspirational. I honestly believe that the more architects, and there are a few here, Papa has done a really great job with the Gas Foundation in Ijebu-Ode, where he's had a client who understands and is able to push this importance of passive systems, lighting and ventilation. The more people see that, the more people understand the importance, the easier it is to sell. And we have a responsibility as designers to produce responsible architecture, but also balancing the fact that we're providing a service. It's a very delicate book to kind of guide, but it's our responsibility to carry that through.
With the coffee before we Thank you. Okay, all right. Shifting gears. The floods in Nigeria, as we spoke about earlier, have been absolutely horrific, and the numbers are even more dire. 1.3 million people have been displaced. More than 250,000 homes have been destroyed, and more than 600 people have lost their lives. You recently wrote that the climate crisis requires a collective consciousness from the creative industries to look for innovative solutions to combat our reliance on resources, consumption, and waste. We know that this crisis is largely created by the global north, but the global south will feel the repercussions more acutely. What role should architects be playing in combating the climate crisis right now?
We really need to start thinking very responsibly about what we produce as designers, and very consciously thinking about the amount of resources that we pump into our buildings. You know, one of the biggest challenges we have is how we service them, how we light, how we cool buildings, and some of the biggest pulls are not just on the materials we build with, and thinking about responsibly using materials that are easy to recycle, materials that are responsible in their use, their construction and long-term consumption, but resources. Why do we need additional lighting? Why can't we design buildings that use beautiful light bulbs to ensure we have floods of light during the day? Why don't we think about ventilation? Why would we design a building, particularly in this climate that is hot and comfortable? If you think about it, a lot of our traditional structures, long before we had electricity, were comfortable, they were functional. It's very similar to when I went to Sharjah and we saw the wind towers, you know, that would have naturally pulled the hot air up and kept the cool. So you have a cycle, you know. We need to start to go back, to go forward. In a lot of regions, and I know that there are many places that don't have this luxury of passive systems, but where we do have those, we need to push them, we need to imbibe them to reduce the amount of energy consumption that we require.
I'm going to open it up for questions in a few moments because I know that a number of people have some things that they would like to speak with you about. But can we speak about your UNDP project before I open it up for questions? You rebuilt a village in northern Nigeria that was displaced by Boko Haram. I know that this project is one that you are most proud of. Talk to us about the significance of this project. And I'm also wondering how working on this project has changed you both as a person and as an architect.
I believe this is the most impactful work that I have done to date. I'm humbled to have been selected, to have worked on it. If I've learned anything, people are people everywhere. It's the lottery of birth. None of us get to pick where we get dropped, you know. And to sit with a community who have been displaced for almost 10 years, and to see their dignity was very humbling. And to learn about their culture, to learn about what was important to them, but also the wisdom to know that when you deal with a project on this scale, that you're dealing with many stakeholders, that you have a lot of people you need to keep happy, but the responsibility you have as an architect to the end user has been very, very important to me. And to regularly meet with a community that they're no longer a mass of people, but you have individual faces, you know who has gone into which house, was very powerful. And if I take anything away from this experience, is the fact that no matter who you're designing for, whether it's a very wealthy person or someone who doesn't have very much, you're always thinking about the end user and their needs, and ensuring that you are being a responsible designer and you are hopefully giving them a space that at the end of the day, long after you have left the project, they are happy.
Okay, time for some questions from the audience. Don't be shy. I'll start calling out names. Hello?
So I have a question. So what would you do to improve architecture in Nigeria, in Lagos? So if you look at a lot of the buildings around, right? Because when I started doing this project, I knew I didn't want very small windows. I knew I wanted overhangs to keep the building cool. I wanted to use nature. And so based on what's around now, and particularly the education of architects here, what would you do to change the curriculum and transform architecture here?
I mean, this is a very big question, and I'm not sure I can answer it all in one go. But I think it's especially for myself as a practitioner, because I don't work in academia, and as you probably know, it's not the easiest place to get into Nigeria, to be involved within the university system. But I honestly believe that by producing projects that are examples of how things can be done differently is a good reference point, because as architects, we learn from experience, we learn from the buildings around us. If you don't have exciting projects around, for a young designer, it's difficult to pick a reference point. I remember when I first moved back to Nigeria and I asked people, why are all toilet windows 600 by 600? Who decided this? And nobody could answer. And there is absolutely no reason why a window should be that small. If it's for privacy, I can make it bigger and I can make sure it's opaque so that light passes but it's not a see-through. So when people start to see examples of alternative ways of approaching buildings and then understanding the principles behind them, that eventually gives you a ripple effect. I recently had somebody copy one of my buildings, and I'll be honest, I was actually very upset. But but then, the importance is it became a reference. It's much better for the city, it's much better for the for the end users, and it's much better for the urbanism.
Okay.
Am I allowed one more?
Oh, you are allowed. We're in your house. You're allowed as many questions as you'd like, sir.
Okay, so the other issue about Lagos is flooding, right, and water. And this is going to be, in the next sort of, even 10 years, this is going to be very difficult. And so, how aware are you of solutions to that problem? What can we actually do? What can the city do to protect people, especially people who live by the sea? And this is going to be a big problem, not just for Lagos, but for the whole of the world. And so, this is an existential problem. So how would you address this, and how would you even advise people in power to really take it very seriously and start dealing with it?
I think Dr. Lawanson would be great to answer this, but in my humble opinion, one of the biggest challenges, or one of the biggest problems that creates the challenge of flooding is lack of enforcement of planning. The fact the city is densifying and we have planned canals, drainage routes, and for example in Lagos where people build over them or it's full of rubbish, the minute we have a very heavy downpour, they're full. I mean, that's one aspect. Another aspect that we have challenges to do with flooding is in the middle belt of the country where there's a lot of deforestation. So you have a lot of loose soil, you have landslides. The factors affecting that are completely different. We have a big problem with deforestation in Nigeria. A lot of our wood is being carted off to China. People know, no one's saying anything. There's probably a hand being greased. It's giving issues to the herdsmen. People are losing grazing ground. People are fighting for smaller locations of land. There's so many factors that affect this. But ultimately, in reality, policy. We really do need to have people in positions of power, in governance, who understand the importance of these ripple effects, because one small thing that has been allowed to go underneath the table creates such a big tsunami effect somewhere else. And in many situations, they don't understand how these things relate. And when you start to deal with the organization of like a country, which is almost like a body, if you don't appreciate the effects that this component has on the other, these are the results that we see. And a lot of the problems we have in Nigeria have to do with that. As individuals, as architects, as designers, we all know that if I decide to not dump my plastic on the road, I have contributed my little quota. It's important that we remember this. Remember the small-scale contributions we can make as individuals. Governance does need to do the big picture with policy, but as individuals, we owe it as our responsibility. As designers, to design more responsibly. As city dwellers, to be more responsible without consumption. Everybody use less plastic, to move the conversation forward. I do a lot of projects at the beach. It is disheartening how much plastic is on the coastline. Even individuals that have properties, they responsibly have, people within the community pick up the rubbish. But in the next 2 days, it's all back. It's such a big problem, and it does need big governance solutions, but it does need the one-to-one scale of the individual as well. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Hi, Tosin. Thank you very much. My question is a parallel to Inka's first question. How do you bridge the gap for conservative clients? How do you sell contemporary means of building to them? Because I mean, like, it's commonly said here that Nigerians and by extension Africans have a lot of money, but not a lot of taste. So in a nutshell, how do you sell contemporary to conservative clients who have the resources to afford?
So, funny enough, I actually just went to business school. If I've learned anything is you must understand your market. We are a very lifestyle-driven society. If you can package it well, you're more likely to get people to buy it. Not because they believe in it, but because they know the next person has it, and they aspire to be like that person. This model might not necessarily work in another part of the world, but I honestly believe that's how we have to push it. You get one project, you represent it well, you get it published, you make it exciting, and people come to you and say, I want that. And you're able to create that ripple effect. I completely understand what you're saying. Yes, we do live in that kind of society. As architects, I know, Jackie, a client shows you a magazine and says that's what they want. By the time you get your work published, they'll be telling you that's what they want. So you have to come at it from their angle. That's the only way to get things done in Nigeria. And it's also knowing the wisdom when to stop pushing. Because, remember, like I said, we're providing a service. If you push too hard and you see your client is not listening, you need to stop. Because the last thing you want is to gain the reputation as a difficult person who is pushing their agenda and not listening to the client. As they say, the client is always right. But as a designer, you have to make them want where you're going. And as long as you're able to get them on board, then it's easier to have that positive agenda.
While we wait for another question or two, can we talk about why you hate air conditioning?
Okay, I don't hate air conditioning, but I am very against air conditioning because I think it's the one single invention that completely changed the way we live everywhere in the world. You know, it has afforded us a luxury that in many situations we should not have. I'm going to give an example of when I was in Sharjah. This was so fascinating. I was in Sharjah in September, which is one of the hottest times of the year, and we went to the American University of Sharjah. And when we were driving in, I saw someone wearing a sweater walking across the road. And I thought, we're in the desert. But the fact is, the buildings are really cold. And when you realize that air conditioning has changed the way we dress, it's changed the way we live. In the Nigerian banquet, people wear sweaters, but our climate, if this was in the 1930s, everyone would have worn cotton. And we would have made sure, that there was a louvered system, that there was cross ventilation, there was shading, and I think that when we start to think about some of the challenges we have and how much energy consumption we require, if we didn't have air conditioning, I think the way we live today would have been very, very different. Maybe we would have had more innovative solutions in terms of ensuring we're able to keep buildings cool. It's so common in Nigeria that you go to some very dense parts of the city and the street is so hot because everybody's outdoor unit is blowing on the road to create a fridge in the, it's completely skewed. So even external spaces are much more uncomfortable than they would have been if we didn't have air conditioning. So that's my...
Your rant against air conditioning. Love it. Okay. Oh, Alani, hi. Okay.
I just want to, what can we do, if you look at most of the time the cost of building is just so high. Architecture can be in a silo. How can we develop material engineering? Because if you look at a typical building, 90% is imported up to ordinary pipe. Our industry for manufacturing, I think, I don't know, maybe you can really expatiate on that.
So I'm so happy that we are having this conversation because yesterday, Shishinwara told us that 80%, 75% of what has been put in this building was done locally. And he insisted on it. It's not impossible, it can be done. But also it's the responsibility we have as practitioners in ensuring that we do research and development into materials that are available locally. If we don't push that and make them attractive, because one of the biggest challenges we have in Nigeria with materials, people will say, oh, it won't last. That's why they want to import it. It doesn't last because research and development wasn't done to ensure that the material was hard-wearing. Remember that it's a much bigger ecosystem. You have the client who pays, you have the architect who designs, you have the material experimentation. If the cycle isn't done efficiently, if the material isn't going to be durable, the wealthy client who really doesn't care how it's done will not want it. He wants peace of mind to know that once it's done and it's fine. So it's a complete cycle. And we'll be hearing from Adeshokunbi, who has done a lot of work in experimentation. And the traditional way of executing buildings doesn't necessarily allow for that. So if you go down the standard route of being a designer, there's a contractor, the contractor takes from your specification and then produces a finished product. But someone like Ade has worked within the profession as an architect builder. He's part of the process. His team they develop the construction methodology. And because he has the luxury of not sitting at the other end of the table, when it doesn't work, he can correct it, he can adapt, and he can grow from it. And I believe that would have probably been if we think about prior to the way we practice now, if this was 100 years ago, there was no architect, there was no builder, it was just people who produced buildings. And they learned and they developed as they go along. But in this environment, especially with cost, it's almost forcing us to look within. And again, this goes back to the idea of the creativity that can come from being in this environment. I'm an architect who is at the younger end of the profession. I also don't have the most affluent of clients, but they like nice things. and they've been exposed, and it's forced us to have to really think about solutions that we can get locally. And it's not necessarily always about using a traditional material, but if we're working with manufacturers locally to produce windows and doors at a better quality to ensure that we keep the client happy, but we're also reducing the carbon footprint of things traveling a long distance, we're contributing towards that. So in a funny way, the fact that the economy isn't great is a good thing because it forces local designers to push boundaries, but we do need to get to a point where we're able to produce more durable materials and finishes.
I want to really quickly speak about the fact that an African man from Burkina Faso won one of architecture's highest honors this year, the Pritzker Prize.
Yes.
I know he's been an incredible influence on your work. Can you speak to me about seeing something like that and how significant it was to you?
I think it's really important that Francis Carey won that award because for a lot of the African architects who have had a global audience, I won't say they have adapted themselves, but they very much are sitting at par with what's happening in the West. Francis Carey has not changed who he is. He hasn't tried to adapt to a typology. He has taken forward this idea of contextuality and he has presented it. And it has been celebrated. And I think he's opened up a door to a lot of young designers to realize that we can push this idea of context. We can push these materials. They are beautiful, they are durable when used well, and they can really create an aesthetic language that hasn't been seen at this scale with this level of presence. And for that, opening that portal of awareness is so powerful.
One of the things that was groundbreaking about what he did, and it sort of alludes to the point you were making earlier about the importance of Africans building in Africa for Africans, is that he realized that in Burkina Faso, concrete didn't quite work for that climate, and that mud bricks were actually better for that environment specifically.
Exactly.
So just sort of piggybacking on what Alan was asking about.
Yes.
And that's why it came to mind. Okay, so let's shift back to Sharjah. Final thoughts about November 2023. Make the case for why we should all be in Sharjah at the Triennial in November 2023.
The Triennial is going to be, it's going to be an opportunity to see voices that people haven't heard. There are people whose work is coming up, has been seen, has been celebrated, but it's an audience for people doing great work, quietly minding their business, where we're going to see what they've been pushing and hopefully, I guess, change the narrative of what we consider as good, innovative technologies and building experiences. It's really good. I mean, I don't want to preempt it, but I do believe that the reviews will show that it will definitely be different. It will be different, and it will be different in a very positive way.
Well, I'm going to be your plus one. I've already making the case for why I should be there with you in 2023. Thank you for this powerful and incredible conversation, Tosin.
One more question.
Oh, okay. Let's keep it going.
Hi, Tosin. I know that you are a fan and student of history.
Yes.
And thank you for introducing the concept of the responsible designer who pursues a solution with intent. How do we approach adaptability and sustainability with equal intent? And with regards to impermanence and perhaps conservation, what do we keep and what do we recycle?
What do we keep and what do we recycle? Gosh, big questions. I think ultimately, and I will relate this with my work, I think it's important. There are certain elements that are of value. Not everything can be carried forward, but I think the lessons we take are from the experiences of how people use space. Funny enough, when I say that I don't think that we have an architecture that at least comes across as an aesthetic identity, if you think about the African home, there is a very standard use of space, and I'm going to go as far back as prior to the creation of towns. You have small settlements, and I relate it with the project I just finished in Maiduguri. The traditional Islamic home or Kunari or Hausa home was always built along the lines of a reception building. You have a reception building where the male visitors are allowed in the home, so they're not on the street. You will always have a courtyard in the middle. You will always have individual rooms for wives. You will have an individual room for the owner of the home. And then you will have a series of storage spaces for grain, food, and maybe an indoor or outdoor kitchen, and then obviously where there is the convenience. That typology of the courtyard house, which is also what we have here, is consistent. So that element of how we use our space has stayed. How do we adapt our architecture, the language, to that use? Africans will always use space the way they use space. And I think every people have a way they use space. And it's not necessarily for us to adapt to the architecture, but for the architecture to adapt to us. And that's how we keep that. Have I answered the question?
It's like you said, it's a big question.
It's a very big question, And I remember when I started to question, because history is so important to me. We were not taught history in school, and I've come to history very late. And it's come with an energy and I'm wanting to learn and understand who I am, where I'm from, how my people use space. And sadly, when I started to realize that I couldn't find an aesthetic that had come through with the trajectory of how we've developed, but I realized the importance that use of space has played. Even in a duplex house in Nigeria today, you have a living room downstairs, you have a living room upstairs, you still have this idea of public and private. So these are consistencies that run through, and when you start to pull those connections, you realize that it's not as far off as even though physically it's not representative, we're not that far off from where we should have been, or where we can be going.
Any final questions? All right, thank you all for being here with us this morning. That was a great way to kick off the day. And I think we're going to have a little nibble. Are you going to take some questions individually up here?
No. We have 3 interesting discussions, and it'll be great to involve the other participants. So we'll have a quick tea break, coffee break, and then we'll come back to the practitioners.
Present and also talk about traditional architecture.